Hey everybody, this is Petey from Spinner Rack, and today I'm doing a video on did did Man of Steel kill the Legion of Superheroes? And I keep threatening to do one of these books, which I do really want to do, but I need to get these 3 videos out on the history of it, how they became a success, and ultimately get to the destruction of it. Right? So most people would say, no, Man of Steel torpedoed the Legion, taking Superboy out. And I would say no to that. I'm going to quickly answer this question. My thing I would offer up was 5 years later, the new Legion Superhero series. I think this is the 4th title that they had. They would have, I think, at least 3 more. I usually point to this 5 years later because the Legion of Superheroes was selling post losing Superboy. It was still one of the top titles. They had at least 2 and 3 kind of spin-offs from it, so it was still a franchise at that point. But I can't say this did it either. I have to say that ultimately the crash of 1985 was the thing that kind of killed a lot of franchises for, Marvel and DC, where I think Spider-Man was still rolling, but stuff like Punisher, who had 3 titles, was gone. Stuff like New Teen Titans, who had at least 2 titles at that point, were gone. Legion, who had 2 to 3 titles, they were gone. Superman, who kept his number of titles, but at the same time, it was like Superman was selling, and during the 90s, Batman followed Superman's lead, and then with the New 52, Batman kind of took the lead back. So, yeah, so I answered the question, but at the same time, let's get into the little history of it, right? Because we got all this stuff, we can kind of get into it, right? So just to give you history of how DC works, right? We start out, Superman #1, we have Clark Kent, who discovers his abilities. He said when maturity is reached, he discovered he could easily do all of these things here, right? Right? So that's when after he reached maturity, all these cool things. And then early Clark decides he must turn his titanic strength into channels that would benefit mankind. And so was created Superman, right? So there we go, right? There's no Superboy in here, right? So as DC does, they decided that they would do in the 40s, they would do Tales of Superman as a Boy, and they would do Superboy titles. This was a big hoopla. It's been talked about on our site many times. Suits and all that stuff happened. But they started to do something that would be kind of, if you even consider continuity, but they were kind of making it up as they went along. This was retroactively adding this history to Superboy. And this is not the first time in Superman's history this would happen. Like at first, you'd hear about the highly advanced Krypton, and then at one point all the Kryptonians had power, and then the people wrote in and said if they all had power, why didn't they just fly off? And then they say, oh, the difference in gravity caused it. The red sun that came, I think, later in 50, that Superman found that out on a weird trip with Lois, I think. So ultimately, as they go along, things updated, and this is kind of how comics kind of work. Because Batman, he got stuff added to his history. At one point, it was just the killer kills Thomas Wayne, and Martha dies of a heart attack at the same time. And then I think, who was it? Neil Adams turned it into the person shooting both of them. At that point, they nixed the Golden Age idea that this guy, Joe Chill, killed Batman's parents, and Batman's found him as a sort of a cold case. Green Arrow got his origin kind of updated by Jack Kirby and some of his collaborators. Yeah, so throughout DC's history, they were kind of doing the first sort of retcons and reboots and adding stuff to the history as they went along. You'd find out different bits about Krypton, the possibility of what's the name, Jor-El and Lara being alive, stuff like that, and then as what was it, Supergirl and all that stuff, right? That would lead you to, actually, that would lead to Superboy doing a story about the Legion of Superheroes, which they said the inspiration for the Legion was Superboy, right? So that would be the catalyst for these characters, right? So with Superboy, you would say infer no Legion, right? That's the conceit of it, right? If you do the butterfly effect, and you take out Superboy, what happens? Well, we have our butterfly effect, and that's called Crisis. Crisis rewrites all of that stuff, right? So DC had an out in Crisis because Crisis was a thing where they were retroactively changing their world, right? So stuff like Wonder Woman got changed, and was there anything else doing so with this character here? But this was something where the history is going to be changed from a multiverse to one single world. And we wouldn't find out all of the changes here. They would just hint at some of the stuff that was going on in this story that we'd find out that a lot of things changed that we didn't know, right? So hold on, I'm just going to try to find, where's this thing, right? Well, Psycho Pirate. So if you have this guy here, the Psycho Pirate, he was supposed to be the only person who remembered the real ending, right? Everyone else is supposed to forget. They would know that something happened, but they wouldn't know about the multiverse. The whole aspect of Crisis would be gone, right? That was the idea, kind of rewriting the history. But the Psycho Pirate would be the one guy that remembered everything that happened, right? So the DC didn't have all their plans, all their ducks in a row, and we'll get back to Crisis again probably, right? So it took like 6 months to figure out who was going to do Superman, right? And most people were going to kind of trim the history. It just happened to be burned, right? And so one of the things that we know, how do we know that they were trimming the history, right? Because if we look at who's who, we have Superman on the cover. He's known as Superman 2 here. And Superman 1 is the Golden Age Superman who died in Crisis, or goes into limbo in Crisis. And we have Kara, Supergirl, who died in Crisis, right? So you're saying, well, what did that mean? We did the other thing. We had that fan thing where we do the Bronze Age Superman, where we give him his light, and we give the Bronze Age, I'm not sure if they did Batman, because Batman got a new insert in the redo, but that was to replace the one they did beforehand, right? So people who died in Crisis, they would be listed in here, right? So anyone who died in Crisis got a listing, and then of course he would get a listing that related to Crisis. Superman would get no mention of Crisis in his history. When Wonder Woman would get her new insert, she would get no mention of Crisis, that whole history of what happened to her going back in time, because DC and their conceit of what they were doing with Crisis was going to rewrite history and say, this is it. This is the storyline. So you didn't need a fan who's who, where we introduced the Bronze Age Aquaman, the Bronze Age Wonder Woman, and the Bronze Age Superman. This was supposed to be it, right? They were doing that. The only thing they were keeping was maybe, I think, Captain Carrot. That was the only other thing they were keeping. So if you look at this and how they were writing who's who post-Crisis, it was wrote with this in mind, that this was a new Earth that had nixed everything because they went through Crisis. That's what happened. And I think fans had gotten to a point where they were kind of utilizing the post-crisis, but then it kind of been like, well, we can't really use Crisis. We like Crisis. Crisis isn't something we can look at as a bad thing that erased the history of everything, right? Even though it got rid of all those worlds, we got Man of Steel to point the finger at, right? So I've given you an instance of how that's put together, right? And you say, I still don't believe you. Well, if that's the case, you think I'm going to go to 5 years later? Nope, I'm going to go to another DC classic, right? The one that's going to be hard to kind of look at because these trades don't really bend well, right? We have the history of the DC universe. And this would show you what the world was like in this new reality, this new post-crisis reality. Now, of course, DC is always changing, and they were retconning as it went along. So they had to do other who's. They had to do updates. Things that were once one way were changed after that. So it sounds like a Bill Burr line that he used in one of my favorite skits he did. But this one would have the Legion in it, right? So we'd have a Superman with no Superboy. We'd have the Byrne, what's the name? Spaceship from Krypton, right? And I'm going to try to do this. Did I do? Of course I pulled the wrong one. I still pulled the wrong one here, right? So we go to history of the DC universe. You'd have all this new thing. They would say Crisis, but they wouldn't get into too much about it, right? They would say the thing about 5 Earths remaining, but to the heroes, they wouldn't really remember all of that stuff, right? And here's Legion, right? It's gorgeous drawing by George Perez, right? And here in this insert, they would not talk about any connection to Superboy, right? But there's a lot of characters to work from. Just there's not something, it'd be a situation the same like Superman where you just couldn't draw from the past history and utilize Superboy, right? So there you go. This is here. They look all in their splendor. They look still ready to go, fight and do their thing, right? So it's a company-wide thing where they've already decided Paul Levitt is not a little guy just writing the Legion. He's one of the DC editorial guys, so he was in the room when Byrne it was announced via the company, and Byrne and Paul Levitt talked, and Byrne said to Paul Levitt, "Hey, this is going to affect you the most," and Paul Levitt didn't really have too much issues with it, and Byrne didn't know why. A little while later, he came back and said, "We have to do something. We have to figure out what happened." And that's when Byrne came up with the Pocket Universe, right? It's possibly from the Legion fandom was still pretty strong, so they probably were writing in because they weren't buying into the Crisis angle. So this is my opinion. I don't know. So ultimately, they did this story. Now, this story, at the same time, people have gone, kind of hogwash. Pocket Universe shouldn't have done it, blah, blah, blah. But it's not like DC hadn't done it before, right? Here's the story. Right, I pointed this out to you before, right? In this story, it's the wedding of Lightning Lad and Saturn Girl, right? Superboy's leaving. Can't even tell it's Smallville, right? He's going to the future because that's how far in the background it is. Superman gets here, reality's changed. The whole reality's changed. So this shows that what happens in the past can affect the Legion, right? And you can't necessarily get rid of the Legion with the butterfly effect, but changes can happen, right? And in this story, there's a militia with these skulls. You can tell they're militia because they got skulls in their head, futuristic kind of militia, and they have all these protocols. And Superboy is the only one who remembers the history. Where in this one, they wind up in Smallville, just trying to escape the time trapper, and they realize that Superboy is actually a problem, right? And they try to enlist Superman, who they didn't realize, but they think of him as, since Superman by mistakenly attacks the Legion. They think it's Superboy again, so they fight him. They're thinking he's on the take too, but then Superboy comes, and it's all-out brawl between immensely powerful Superboy and depowered Superman, who has his experience that it allows him to survive the fight, but the fact that he realizes in him surviving this fight with someone that's infinitely more powerful than him, he realizes that it's also all a ruse, which leads to Superboy saving the day but not making it out, right? But at the same time, the books were selling like hotcakes. So ultimately, Paul Levitt is doing his run post that part. It's still successful. And then he decides, because he's already done possibly 3 runs on the title. He did one in the 70s during the backup stages, or when it was just getting the regular title. He came back in issue 280. He was there for the relaunch of the new title when there was 2 titles going, Legion of Superheroes and Tales of the Legion of Superheroes, before it became a reprint book, maybe 20 or 30 issues in. And then he gave it to, well, I spoiled that. He gave it to Keith Giffen and said, hey, you want to take over and write it? And he's like, yeah. But he wanted it to be different from what Paul Levitt did. So Paul Levitt's period would be kind of still there, and he would take this title 5 years earlier. Now, he would add a lot of story in it, doing his sort of Watchmen, Dark Knight effect, a lot of these. So there's a lot of story in here. It's not really visually the strongest of Keith Giffen's work, but there's a lot of story here, right? He also has co-writers, Tom and Mary Bierbaum. They are, I think they're part of the Legion Outpost. I think that's who they were. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, right? This is them in the future, them being adults, and he was going to do his way, and DC was pretty gung-ho about it. Since Keith Giffen was still pretty big name at that point, they were just going to be like, just have at it, just have fun, do whatever you want. Slowly, the bloom was off the rose, but they did this origin issue, right? And this would be an origin without Superboy, right? And they would do basically, since they're heroes, they have a heroic moment without Superboy. In this story, we have a Durlin who's being treated badly, and he gets helped, and then at the same time, we have Brand, who's in this story, who's the guy who kind of their beneficiary. He's all through this book, and they kind of trying to. It's a struggle between Brand and one of his helpers, and then ultimately he gets saved. And that's the thing, they're doing this Howard Chaykin like type of telling stories like it would be on like a TV, where there's a side story going on in between the dialogue, and that would lead these 3 great Legionnaires saving Brand, right? And he would then back them to become superheroes, right? So they came up with a little origin that would be without Superboy, and then the title was rolling, and then at some point they went back to them being kids, and they kind of rebooted the title after that. They were younger, and then after that, I think there's a Mark Waid one where they're older again, and I think Supergirl joins it at some point. Then you have Secret Origin with some Superboy titles. Then there's another Secret Origin that doesn't have Superboy, that Paul Levitt did, that's in the 2000s. So it's kind of the thing that did happen post this, that they just kept rebooting the title. But for my money, Man of Steel isn't the reason. DC just routinely reboots their stuff all the time. They've always had, they always will be. The fact that one of the things that Mark Waid complains about, I think in here, is that Superboy was gone. We couldn't do Superboy stories. They couldn't do Thanagarians because of the changes in that. They couldn't do any Green Lantern stuff because there were changes in Green Lanterns. So it's one of those things where, as DC goes along, they've never wanted to be trapped in continuity. Even though they did Crisis, even though they had Crisis on there and they're saying we're fixing it, as it went along, nobody wants to be stuck in the same continuity. They want to be able to do whatever they want. And obviously, the whipping boy of of the post-crisis universe is Man of Steel, and he took away Superboy from the title, so that would be the one to attack first. But ultimately, it's just one of those things where I think the Legion have, you look at the picture that George Perez did, that they had enough characters and enough locales and worlds. And Keith Giffen also said what he liked about the book was that he was able to create worlds. So you're not stuck doing like the regular DC universe. They're always out in space, and it's a large cast of characters that you can rotate, which I think was hence why Paul Levitt goes back to the book so much, because he had a good handle on it, probably the best one of the best handles on it outside of the original storytellers, who basically were trying to do the best story for Mort Weisinger, right? So there we go. I'm taking the blame off of Man of Steel, and I'm giving up the GOAT and not blaming the new Legion of Superheroes. It was just a different take, and I'm giving it to the crash of the 90s, right? That's my take on it. I know this is a hotbed issue, so, we can play around. But, let's go back to this. As you go, DC is the king of changing things in their history, right? Goes against what it says, right? It's just like, hey, we're just going to do stories, and that's the fun part of it, right? Not getting stuck into, hey, we did this, we can't do this now. Because DC has been something where we kind of understood these changes. We kind of accepted them until we didn't, so that's it. Spinner Rack out.